reports from the scene by at least one reporter on the scene who said that it was a missile strike. A senior Pentagon official says that it's simply not true. It wasn't a U.S. strike. Now, to punish those behind today's attacks, the United States and its people must first determine who they are. We are a country that believes in facts and the pursuit of facts. The facts are few about who's responsible for this. There has been much speculation, italicize, underscore the word speculation about that today, with Osama bin Laden, the renegade Saudi millionaire, frequently mentioned. No one knows who did this. CBS's Jim Stewart in Washington is following the investigation, checking his sources, and has this live report. Jim.
Dan, apparently we have a little bit more now than just speculation. U.S. intelligence officials and law enforcement no longer have just a theory about today's unprecedented attack. They now have some evidence, and it all points to Osama bin Laden. Sources tell CBS News that hours after the attack, intelligence agents detected what one official is calling significant indicators that the suicide planes were hijacked by members of al-Qaeda, the terrorist group that reports to bin Laden. Sources describe the intelligence as communications intercepts, but would not provide any details. It's not definitive, said one official, but it is persuasive. Sensing that bin Laden would quickly become a suspect, Afghanistan's ruling Taliban party, which has been giving him safe refuge, called a press conference. We do not allow Osama bin Laden to operate from our land, the Taliban said, warning the U.S. not to take any, quote, speedy actions to retaliate. Meanwhile, law enforcement sources said there had been no credible claims for the joint attacks and that intelligence had picked up no specific threats aimed at targets inside the United States before the attacks took place. Within minutes of today's attacks, officials were pointing to the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center by a group with ties to bin Laden, citing it as proof that bin Laden has never given up on his dream to destroy the symbol of America's economic power. And in recent months, analysts say bin Laden has only become more and more sophisticated in his attempts to strike at the United States. They point specifically to his simultaneous attack on 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa.
They also went directly against a U.S. destroyer, which was heavily guarded, and they did put a hole in that ship, the USS Cole. So they have a track record of conducting attacks that one would think they might not be capable of.
Late today, the U.S. intelligence community was rapidly sorting through a priority list of potential suspects within the U.S. for electronic eavesdropping, with sources saying the number may reach into the hundreds. There is also specific physical evidence that investigators are eager to examine. First are the transcripts of communications between the suicide aircraft and ground controllers, and second are cockpit tape recordings of conversations in the doomed aircraft themselves. The working theory is that the hijackers were pilots themselves and forcefully took over the controls to dive the jets straight into their targets. Dan?
Jim Stewart, good work with getting that new information about increasing evidence, real hard evidence, nothing conclusive yet, that bin Laden is tied to this. But do U.S. intelligence officials know where bin Laden is? Still in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Baluchistan? Do they have any idea?
As recently as the beginning of the week, they had reason to believe that he was hanging out in the 2 locations that he has most frequently been at in Afghanistan, and that's the cities of Jalalabad and Kandahar. Now, he travels frequently, Dan, and he does so by SUV and caravans with sometimes as many as 100 guards. It's a safe bet that he is on the move again tonight.
United States Secretary of Defense, thank you, Jim Stewart. U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld has begun a briefing at the Pentagon. We pick it up in progress live.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the Secretary just said, today we have watched the tragedy of an outrageous act of barbaric terrorism carried out by fanatics against both civilians and military people. Acts that have killed and maimed many innocent and decent citizens of our country. I extend my condolences to the entire Department of Defense families, military and civilian, and to the families of all those throughout our nation who lost loved ones. I think this is indeed a reminder of the tragedy and the tragic dangers that we in and day out, both here at home as well as abroad. I would tell you up front, I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
Chairman. Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Carl Levin.
Our intense focus on recovery and helping the injured and the families of those who were killed is matched only by our determination to prevent more attacks and matched only by our unity to track down, root out, and relentlessly pursue terrorists, states that support them, and harbor them. They are the common enemy of the civilized world. Our institutions are strong, and our unity is palpable.
Senator John Warner.
Thank you. As a past chairman preceding Carl Levin, I can assure you that the Congress stands behind our president, and the president speaks with one voice for this entire nation. This is indeed the most tragic hour in America's history, and yet I think it can be its finest hour, as our president and those with him, most notably our Secretary of Defense, our chairman, and the men and women of the armed forces all over this world stand ready not only to defend this nation and our allies against further attack, but to take such actions as are directed in the future in retaliation for this terrorist act, a series of terrorist acts unprecedented in world history. We call upon the entire world to step up and help, because terrorism is a common enemy to all, and we're in this together. The United States has borne the brunt, but who can be next? Step forward and let us hold accountable and punish those that have perpetrated this attack. Again, I commend the Secretary, the Chairman, and how proud we are. We spoke with our President here moments ago. He's got a firm grip on this situation, and the Secretary and the General have a firm grip on our armed forces and in communication of the world over.
Thank you very much. We'll take a few questions and then we'll adjourn. Charlie.
Mr. Secretary, did you have any inkling at all in any way that something of this nature and something of this scope might be planned?
Charlie, we don't discuss intelligence matters.
I see. And how would you respond if you find out who did this?
Obviously, the President of the United States has spoken on that subject, and those are issues that he will address in good time.
Mr.
Yes.
Secretary, we are getting reports from CNN and others that there are bombs exploding in Kabul, Afghanistan. Are we at the moment striking back, and if so, is the target Osama bin Laden and his organization?
I've seen those reports. They, in no way is the United States government connected to those explosions.
What about Osama bin Laden? Do you suspect him as the prime suspect in this?
It's not the time for discussions like that.
Mr. Secretary.
A show of bipartisan support and solidarity at the Pentagon with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld orchestrating this bipartisan appearance by members of Congress and General Hugh Shelton, the chairman of the Military Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. That'll go on for a bit, but the Secretary of Defense never noted for talking a lot under crisis circumstances, making it clear he wasn't going to say a lot about what's going on. President Bush condemned the terrorist attacks. He vowed to bring those responsible to justice when it is determined who did it. The president is now back in Washington, headed at last report for the White House itself. He intends to address the nation from Washington this evening. We expect that at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. That'd be 8 Central, and of course 6 p.m. On the West Coast. CBS News Chief White House Correspondent John Roberts has the latest. John?
Dan, even as the president makes his way back to the White House, the administration is still trying to come to grips with the scope of this tragedy. Secret Service sources tell CBS News that this indeed was just like Pearl Harbor. There was nothing on their threat assessment, no warning that this was coming.
The president was in Florida when word of the attacks first broke. Reading with a group of elementary students, Mr. Bush was stopped cold when his chief of staff delivered the news.
Move everybody across the street.
Moments later, in Washington, an urgent call to evacuate the White House.
I'm told that a plane went into the Pentagon and they're chasing us off the grounds here.
It was an extraordinary scene as staff and the press corps were rushed from the grounds. If the Pentagon had been targeted, the Secret Service feared the president's home could be next.
Get everybody back. Everybody back.
Fire trucks took up positions on Pennsylvania Avenue, while SWAT teams stood vigil from the roof. Police sealed off a 2-block area around the White House. The only ones left inside the mansion, the vice president and his national security team, coordinating a response to the crisis from the Situation Room. With a continuing threat in Washington, the Secret Service would not allow the president to return and had him fly immediately to the security of Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward.
The full scope of the tragedy now apparent, Mr. Bush addressed the nation and vowed these acts of terrorism will not stand.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
From Barksdale, the president headed for Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, home of the Strategic Air Command, where he conferred with his national security staff about how to proceed. Confident that the White House had been secured, he then headed back for Washington, determined to send a signal to the world that America would stand strong in the face of these horrible acts.
And Dan, some more tough talk tonight from the president ahead of his address to the nation. A report just filed from aboard Air Force One. His spokesman, quoting the president, is saying, "We will find these people and they will suffer the consequences of taking on this nation. We will do what it takes. No one is going to diminish the spirit of this nation." Dan?
John Roberts in Washington Live. John, what's the security situation at the White House at this moment?
Well, Dan, the White House is still locked down. We are not allowed back in. There is a small crew that's been allowed back in to tape the president live tonight at 9 o'clock. You can see the helicopters are just starting to arrive on the south lawn of the White House. Dan, as a security precaution, Air Force One, which is always shadowed by fighter jets wherever it travels, was more than shadowed today. On its way back from Nebraska, there was an F-15 positioned on each wing. And even now, Dan, every once in a while, we hear a fighter jet flying combat air patrol, if you will, over Washington, D.C., something this nation never thought they would see happen. Again, the president just now arriving back at the White House. We'll hear from him later on tonight.
At 9 o'clock Eastern Time. Thanks, John Roberts. One of the few things that seem certain tonight is that these hijackings and attacks were meticulously planned and carried out with great precision. It also took a lot of money to do it. All of that is strongly supported by hard facts now at hand. CBS News correspondent Bob Orr, who covers aviation for us, has pieced it together. Bob?
Well, Dan, there's no doubt at all it was a highly coordinated attack, launched with simultaneous breaches of security at 3 of the nation's busiest airports this morning. Under the cover of the hectic morning rush hour, when airports are particularly vulnerable, hijackers boarded 4 large passenger jets, 2 each from American Airlines and United Airlines, 2 of the strongest symbols of U.S. aviation.
American Flight 11, a Boeing 767, took off first at 7:45 this morning from Boston bound for Los Angeles. 13 minutes later, another 767, United Flight 175, also left Boston for L.A. At virtually the same moment, United Flight 93, a 757, took off from Newark for San Francisco. And to the south at Washington's Dulles Airport, another 757, American Flight 77, flew off towards Los Angeles. The first sign that anything was wrong was noticed by air traffic controllers, who watched the jets stray from their planned routes. This computerized radar path shows how the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, climbed out of Boston and, as expected, headed northwest across Massachusetts. But watch what happened. As the plane entered eastern New York, it turned sharply to the south and headed straight for Manhattan. The 767 hit the World Trade Center at 8:48 this morning. And 16 minutes later, United Flight 175 delivered the second blow. The jets, fueled for cross-country flights, were filled with tens of thousands of gallons of volatile fuel. They were literally flying bombs, each with an explosive power far greater than the blast that leveled the Oklahoma City Federal Building. Based on radio communications from the planes, FAA authorities knew they were dealing with a terrorist attack and immediately moved to close New York and Washington airports. And for the first time in U.S. history, all flights across the country were grounded.
airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
But there were still 2 hijacked jets in the air, and one of them, American Airlines Flight 77, took aim on the Pentagon. It crashed in a fireball at 9:38. Meanwhile, the 4th plane, the flight from Newark to San Francisco, was heading west, and it traveled all the way into northeastern Ohio. The controllers monitoring radar watched as the jet then did a U-turn and headed back towards the East Coast. At 10:20, 2.5 hours after the 4-pronged attack was launched, the plane crashed in a rural Pennsylvania field.
I haven't heard a plane come through.
This is Washington, D.C. This is the South Lawn of the White House as we leave our colleagues at CBS News and their programming. We're going to join Fox News at the top of the hour, but this is Marine One, bringing the U.S. President George Bush, who started the day in Florida and was told, as you saw in the CBS coverage, of the terrible news of the incidents which at that time were just people were just becoming aware of in both New York and in Washington, of course, at the Pentagon building. He was told there his daily schedule was come to an abrupt halt, and he was flown to Air Force bases and has spent much of the day in Air Force One, a position from which he can run the country and indeed, as our correspondent was saying, run a war if he has to. George Bush returning to Washington, D.C. He's due to make an address by television in a couple of hours' time, an address which you will, of course, be able to see live here on Sky News. Most of this area evacuated, the usual press facilities which are provided at the White House abandoned for the day. Much of Washington now quiet. But the President has determined that it is the right thing that he should return to his home and his seat of power.
Well, on this day of almost unspeakable horror, let's just see how the British morning papers are reflecting today's catastrophic events, and as you can imagine, all are dominated by the dramatic pictures which do of course tell their own story. The Telegraph says the United States is on a war footing after the most devastating terrorist attack in history. It says the atrocity was meticulous in its coordination and horrifying in its effect.
The Guardian describes it as a brutal declaration of war.
Well, that's also the headline in The Express, which describes a world on the brink as America and the rest of the globe try to come to terms with the inexplicable events.
The Mail's headline is simply apocalypse.
And The Sun describes the events as the day that changed the world.
That was one of the horrific images which will stay with us for the rest of our lives. It sums up just part of the horror which unfolded in New York as the centre was struck by not one but 2 aircraft. And minutes later, in Washington, the Pentagon struck by a 3rd. That's the Sky coverage for the moment. We're now joining our colleagues at Fox News for a special report.
The leaders here, and then, of course, later on in the evening from the President of the United States. In the meantime, back to you in New York, Shep.
Britt, thanks. It is 7 o'clock in the east, 4 o'clock in the west. I'm Shepard Smith in New York, and this is Fox News' continuing coverage of the terrorism strike against the United States. You are looking live now, coming up at the southern tip of Manhattan, where the smoke continues to billow over what was once one of America's proudest symbols, 210-story towers looming over the day skyline, looking directly over the Statue of Liberty, providing spectacular views of one of America's most spectacular cities, and today reduced to rubble. There is a massive and unprecedented cleanup effort underway on the streets below. 3 buildings have now collapsed there, and in Washington, D.C., part of the Pentagon ripped to shreds as America has come under attack. All of this began this morning about 9 o'clock Eastern Time when radar traffic controllers realized there was a plane heading in and fast, and suddenly not 1 but 2 jets had pummeled into the 2 towers of the World Trade Center. First the one on the east side, then the one on the west side. In the moments which followed, chaos on the streets below. People were reported to be coming out of buildings, one after another, trying to give aid to their neighbors as the smoke and flames began to tower out of the World Trade Center. 80 stories up for one of them, a higher distance for the other. And there are literally people hanging out of the windows here as you watch. There is a jet plane inside that tower of the World Trade Center as this man or woman hangs out and wonders what in the world has happened around him or her on an early morning day, a Tuesday morning, just getting to the office to begin the nation's work. The flames continued to tower, and then minutes later, the first of the two towers collapsed to ruin beneath. At the time, many of New York's bravest and New York's finest, the fire department, the police department, was on scene giving aid to those who suddenly saw their world collapsing around them, and then the building tumbled down onto their heads, and now a massive scene of destruction beneath as people working with hands and tools scramble to try and find anyone in there who may be alive. The entire New York City Police Department and entire New York City Fire Department brought into work. Every single human being who was part of those two operations was called in this morning. Now the United States military has brought in 2 aircraft carriers to station in New York Harbor. One will be used as a hospital. The National Guard and members of the military to come in and assist in this rescue and recovery effort, which clearly even the largest police and fire forces in all of the United States could simply not handle. Many have described this as America now at war, certainly an unprecedented attack. The number for the death toll is unthinkable at this hour, and no one willing to speculate except for one representative who made his way out of the Washington Police headquarters this afternoon, or early this morning actually, and suggested that the estimates were that as many as 10,000 lives may have been lost in lower Manhattan. Our correspondent Catherine Herridge has been following developments throughout the day. She's with us from one of the hospitals besieged with patients this day. Catherine, how's it going there?
Actually, Shepard, within the last few minutes, I've had a very disturbing conversation with 2 of the residents from St. Vincent's Hospital who have been down at one of the triage centers, and they had only treated one person. They were told by rescue workers that because of the intense heat and smoke and debris that it was virtually impossible to go in and rescue anyone who still may be alive and buried beneath the rubble. Now, I just want to take you back in the last few minutes. New York's Governor George Pataki has also been down at the hospital for about the last 20 minutes, in fact. He's been talking, walking around, greeting people, trying to console them as much as he can, and also giving a briefing to reporters. Now, this is what we understand from hospital officials. They've taken 297 patients, approximately 45 in critical condition. Also among that total, 42 rescue workers, so firefighters and police officers. One emergency physician telling me earlier that initially they took waves and it was all primarily rescue workers. I was also told that at some points they were so covered with soot and debris that it was impossible to tell whether they were firefighters or police officers. For the most part, those rescue workers do not have very serious injuries, and we're grateful for that. They're suffering from abrasions to their eyes because of the concrete dust in the air. St. Vincent officials also confirming to us that they've had 3 deaths. When we asked them the cause, they said severe blunt injuries. Some, in fact, fell to their deaths. The under injuries also include multiple fractures and lacerations. Earlier this afternoon, we did have a briefing from New York's Mayor Rudy Giuliani as well as the New York Police Commissioner Bernard Kerik. They confirmed to us that the National Guard is on the scene, approximately 200 guardsmen. They're expecting about 1,500 later this evening. Of course, the city remains on a very heightened state of alert. There was one point, though, in the briefing where the New York mayor really praised the people of this city, saying that they had behaved with dignity and calm, and he really thinks that that presence of mind has helped to save lives. And I'm quoting here. The mayor said, "New York City is a lot stronger than this. We're going to overcome it, and we're going to be an example for everyone how to defeat terrorism, and that it's important for people not to be afraid." Just a couple of anecdotes I want to share with you. When I was down near the World Trade Center, one of the firefighters stopped just briefly and spoke to me, and he said essentially that it was just bedlam. It was like a second Pearl Harbor. Those were his words. And I also asked him what he was concerned about most, and he said, "You know, there are 8 men in my company that are unaccounted for, and I can't go back in for them now. They're just unaccounted for. I've also been talking to family members out here on the street. I spoke to one man, he was a member of one of the carpenters' unions, and he told me that there were dozens of people from his union who were working in the World Trade Center today. He thought perhaps as many as 200 or 300 working on the upper floors, and they've had no word of them. And this is why he came to St. Vincent's, to see if any of them had survived this disaster, Shepard.
Catherine Herridge, live with us from the hospital. We will keep watch there. The numbers, at an initial look, might sound good, that there are just a few hundred people who have been taken to area hospitals, a few hundred people that have been reported to us. There are different ways to read that, of course. The video at which you were just looking was the collapse of the third building there. They call it Building 7 at World Financial Center, a 42-story structure, certainly a building that would have towered above most skylines across America. It was dwarfed, of course, in the shadow of the World Trade Center, but it collapsed just about an hour and a half or so ago, I believe. That was expected. There had been a lot of shaking on Lower Manhattan. They knew that it would come down. The question was when, and now it has. As many as 50,000 people working in that building. Thousands of tourists on a given day would visit as well. And putting numbers together is something that simply cannot yet be done. Seeing those pictures, knowing that, imagine, if you will, the number of people in the city of New York who knew people who went down with TWA Flight 800. Everyone seemed to know someone. Rest assured, everyone does know someone who was inside the World Trade Center this morning. Of course, there was also a horrible explosion a short time after at the Pentagon in Washington. We now know that it was a Boeing 757. The story of how this evolved is now coming out in bits and pieces of reporting, and in a fascinating article by Don Phillips in the Washington Post, which is out late this afternoon, describing controllers watching their radar screen and seeing this very strange object, a large plane, flying at an unusually high speed without the beeper going, meaning the instrument which tells the tower what kind of plane that is, that it is in fact Flight 77 from American Airlines, that was turned off. And according to the reporting by Don Phillips of the Washington Post, this 757 turned tightly and circled. But before so, it was flying at an unusually high speed directly toward the White House. Direct coordinates for the White House. The tower calls authorities minutes before the 757 turned tightly and circled around to slam directly into the Pentagon. The controllers couldn't identify this plane, as I mentioned, and they are now saying the skill with which the plane was flown, including this knowledge of how to turn off the transponder, raised the probability that a trained pilot was at the controls, possibly a hijacker. Sources close to Don Phillips, the staff writer, were not specific about the times of the event, but said that after leaving Dulles, the plane continued